Hello, everybody. Welcome to Iron Culture, presented by Mass. I am Eric Trexler. I'm here with the good Dr. Eric Helms, and we are here, as we tend to be on Monday nights at 7 p.m. Eastern Time, doing the thing. Helms, this is what we do. We come in live on YouTube, 7 p.m. Monday nights, and we answer questions from the good people. Helms, how you doing tonight?
I'm doing well this early afternoon at 1 p.m. on Tuesday. And it's just another great day in paradise. One day ahead and warmer than it probably is over there, I'd imagine, as we're in the middle of summer.
Yeah, we're in a bit of a cold snap here, but you can't complain about winter in North Carolina. It's not a cold place, so we're going to be just fine. Before we get into the good stuff here, the thing I always forget to do is beg the audience to support us because the good Lord knows we need it. So if you like the show, if you like what we're doing and you want to support, there's many ways to do it. You can like, rate, subscribe, review wherever you happen to get this. You may be someone who joins the live chat to ask questions on YouTube. You may find it after the fact on YouTube, catch the replay. Maybe you catch it on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, wherever you get it. Like, rate, subscribe, review. And if you're going to leave a review, don't waste your time. You might as well leave a very, very good one. Usually 5 stars is the norm. Now, you could also submit questions. That's a good way to support the show. It makes the show fun, interesting, and good. You can do that in the live chat if you catch us live, or you can go to massresearchreview.com/ironculture and submit questions after hours whenever you like. And of course, the thing that keeps this all going, the best way to support is by becoming a member of the Mass community. That's the research review that we publish the first of the month. Every month we cover the newest, best, most important research in exercise and nutrition. And we don't just tell you what they did and what they found. Most importantly, we tell you how you might use it for your own training, for your clients' training, etc. So with that out of the way, Helms, we're going to get to questions in the live chat. They're already pouring in. If you're in the live chat, make sure you get in your best questions early so we have a good chance of answering them. But I do want to leave a bit of a teaser here. This is how I want to open the show. So I think not in the upcoming issue of Mass, at least I don't think so. At some point within the next 2 months, either March 1st or April 1st, I think it's time for me to write an article. And I think I know the title already. And the title is going to be something to the effect of, "We have to work because science doesn't." It is going to be an intentionally divisive, controversial title because I'm grumpy. And when you get grumpy, you say controversial things. So the nature of this article is that if you've been a member of the Mass community for a while, you probably remember a zillion years ago, back when you were young and full of life compared to how you feel now, there was an article that came out about apple cider vinegar. Now, there's also a Netflix documentary a Netflix series that just came out, and it's called Apple Cider Vinegar. And my understanding is that it's about a wellness pseudoscience scammer. So interesting. But anyway, there was an article that came out about apple cider vinegar, and I reviewed it in Mass. And the article was pretty splashy because basically apple cider vinegar caused about as much weight loss, actually more weight loss than you would expect if they just took Ozempic instead. And it did so at 3 separate doses in 3 separate samples of people. So basically, I reviewed the article in Mass, and I said, there's a bunch of stuff about this article that's odd. First of all, the really extreme effect sizes. Obviously, that's going to jump off the page at you. They used categorically the wrong statistical tests. It just was not an appropriate analysis. It didn't matter, though, because, frankly, you can use whatever analysis you want with effects that large. It's not going to change anything. But it is still just kind of like a bad sign. Like, why not do the right thing when you can? Why not do the correct thing? There were also, elements of the data that kind of implied really unusual data distributions. For many physiological variables, we assume that if you do random sampling and have a reasonably large sample, that you will get approximately normal distributions in your data. And when you look at, the mean, standard deviation, minimum, and maximum, we kind of looked at the combination of these values, and we were like, the only way for this to all work is to have distributions that make absolutely no sense. So like totally stacked at the minimum, totally stacked at the maximum, no one in between. And it's the type of distributions that you can't really explain, especially if it happens across multiple groups, right? So anyway, there's just a lot of things about this paper, and we're like, hey, we ought to look into this. And then you go to the thing that really bothered me, frankly, was you go to the end of the article where it says, supplementary files and all that stuff at the end, the footnotes that nobody ever reads. And they said, all the data for this study are attached as a supplementary file. And I said, beautiful. That's fantastic. We can just look at the data and get to the bottom of all this. No big deal. I'm sure it's nothing. But then you open up the supplementary file and it's literally a press release. Like, it was just like, hey, look at this really cool paper. There was certainly no data to be found. It was just some person saying how cool the paper is. So I was like, that's not what I call data. A positive, glowing press release about the paper is not actually data. So anyway, I basically got together with a couple people, and I'll get into all the details and write all about it eventually. But we teamed up and kind of voiced these concerns. So the lead author was Vahid Malboubi, and the other author on this was James Heathers, who is data sleuth extraordinaire. He's been, involved in all sorts of really cool projects to kind of do meta science and kind of, poking and prodding at studies that have these types of characteristics on the surface where you say, were their effects this large? Why did these distributions seem so odd? What might be happening here? And another thing that I should mention about this paper, one of the things that also kind of got me kind of annoyed is I'm a bit of a physiology nerd. Actually, scratch that. I hate when people call themselves nerd in a way that's kind of like self-congratulatory, like, oh, I know a lot about things. I like physiology. I'm an enthusiast. And so
you're a trained PhD in exercise physiology, and you've published a tremendous amount on it. I don't even think you need to.
Right, but here's what I'm
dice
saying.
It either way.
Out of respect for nerd culture, I believe if you've never been jammed in a locker and bullied for your nerdiness, you don't get to claim nerd. Okay, so I'm not a nerd. Not that there's anything wrong with that. Tip of the cap to nerds. But anyway, I'm an enthusiast, right? So when I see an astounding weight loss, magnitude of weight loss reported, I don't just say weird. I say, what does that mean? Like physiologically, right? And so in the paper, they reported that they didn't report the actual nutrition data. They didn't report the exercise data. They just said, we collected the data and we assure you that participants did not change their physical activity levels, nor did they change their dietary intakes. We checked and we won't show you. Okay? And so essentially, there's kind of two plausible outcomes for how this worked. If the data, again, like, were reported well and don't require a major correction to actually figure out what the heck happened here. So the two most plausible explanations are, number one, there was severe, catastrophic malabsorption of food to the extent that, like, every person would have probably been hospitalized for dehydration from the diarrhea they were experiencing in the study. The reason I don't think that's the case is because they basically said, like, yeah, no major adverse events, everybody was fine, and 0 dropouts in a 120-person study. Like a multiple week intervention, 120 people, 0 dropouts. So I don't think that they were just simply shitting out hundreds and hundreds of calories a day. Pardon the language.
And by the way, having no dropouts in any study on 120 people is a pretty rare thing, even if your intervention is nothing more than take a pill, answer a question on your phone, be in a control group, because life happens and you just simply can't come to the lab or do the thing, or you changed your email, or you just forgot to do something more often than like 1% of the time.
Yes, yes. So like when we plan studies, depending on how terrible the intervention is, depending how long it is, how much we're asking people to do, we always budget for at least 20 or 30% dropout. Like that's kind of par for the course. So yeah, this was a 12-week study with 120 people that reported zero dropout. But anyway, I don't believe that they were having disastrous diarrhea to the tune of hundreds and hundreds of calories a day. And so then the most plausible explanation is that this increased basal metabolic rate, like in some cases, like 400, 500 calories a day, during certain 4-week periods, up to 700 calories per day. And so that would make this a thermogenic on par with DNP. And the reason that
Solid.
matters is because every couple years you read an article about a person who literally dies from DNP because it increases your basal metabolic rate so much that you literally get hyperthermia and have a cardiac event. So all of that is to say, like, we found all those things to be somewhere between weird and annoying, and basically said, like, here's a letter to the editor. Just report the things that you just simply chose not to report. Show a few plots of these histograms. That would be nice. A few plots of these data distributions just to see, like, what are we working with here? But yeah, just basically help us make sense of this by reporting kind of the bare minimum and doing the stats in the way that everyone else in the field agrees is appropriate. So we wrote that letter to the editor, and they published the response to our letter before they published our letter. Like, there was already a response to it, and I had to go in and, like, annoy the journal and say, like, hey, it sure would help readers if they could see what they're responding to, like, give some context here maybe. So we had to, like, twist our arms and be annoying for weeks on end to just get the thing published that had already been responded to. And the response, as I'll get into my article, is it's nonsensical. It doesn't meaningfully interact with any of the ideas. It doesn't address any of the ideas. It is a complete, like, thank you for your interest. Have a good day. That's pretty much the response that we got. Of course, I'm being facetious and oversimplifying, but we'll put the links in the show notes and people can read it. But it really is an extremely disappointing episode. And so my article is going to be, frankly, about the fact that I'm having a crisis in my brain right now because theoretically, everybody always says, Helms, the beauty of science is that it's self-correcting. In theory, sure, but science is a business now. And the business of science is not self-correcting. And if anything, there is friction that impedes the natural self-correction that would happen in science. You run into so much friction and so much... Again, you have to beg people to publish the letter to the editor that's already been responded to.
Yeah. The study shouldn't have been published.
Correct.
The peer review is obviously subpar.
Right.
The issues with peer review is that the people who are asked to do it are not compensated. They don't have the time for it. Many times I have seen that you don't actually get peer reviewers. The editor is unable to find them. So sometimes you get stock or generalized comments, or the editor steps in and is the quote-unquote peer reviewer. Journal guidelines are sometimes that it needs to be novel, which basically means interesting, or headline grabbing, which can lead to publication bias because either significant or non-significant findings get more influentially published than others, rather than us having a true, accurate perspective on the data, which we see in publication bias, funnel plots when we look at meta-analyses. And sometimes the meta-analyses will publish that and do nothing about it, which also is a problem with poor peer review. And we have an entire cottage industry of publishing that is not necessarily aligned in terms of the incentives, financial or otherwise, with actually correcting the course of the ship, which is why open science is so important, and doing the things you're doing, pre-printing, pre-registering, and finding alternative pathways to the typical kind of publishing empire that puts stuff out there, and you're doing the good work of the community, Trex, and I appreciate it. I know you're annoyed. I know you're grumpy, but you're part of the solution, my friend.
Well, here's the problem, though. So I already wrote a mass article about kind of whining about this, but there was a really crappy article. Sorry to the authors. There was a crappy article about ice baths and cold water exposure, where they're doing cold showers and ice baths. And the moment it came out, I reviewed it immediately and said, this is nonsense, right? Like, this is so bad. And eventually then, like a year later or something, I'll have to double check the timeline. Don't quote me on that. But way too long later, the paper got retracted because it was a mess. It was a complete disaster. However, it had already been shared widely by Andrew Huberman and everyone who listens to Andrew Huberman. And so basically it was like a paper that had just absolutely spread like wildfire. And you can still go to this day and look at the ratio of how many people read the original paper and believed it as fact, and how many people have since read the retraction notice saying, hey, by the way, don't take any of that seriously. And the ratio is so skewed that the retraction is meaningless. Like, it frankly doesn't matter. When the results get out to everyone and then the retraction gets out to no one, you start to wonder, is there any reason for this retraction as it pertains to, like, disseminating science to the public, which is theoretically a major reason we publish work, right? Now, I guess it's good that fellow researchers could then know that you shouldn't cite it, but there's also disastrous statistics about how often retracted papers get cited after they're retracted, you know? I think that's getting better because now software citation, like reference managers, will tell you, hey, idiot, don't cite that. It's been retracted.
Yeah, even NIH PubMed is doing a better job with this. Like when you cite a paper, just like if you click on the PubMed link, it will say correction in, corrigendum in.
Yeah.
Now, so
so things
it's getting better.
There are technological things that ought to make that better, but I'll believe it when I see it. I want to actually watch the rates of cited retracted papers go down before I before I celebrate. But this is just more of the same. So if you go to the website of the journal that published this, I believe it is, now bear in mind this was published in 2024. If I'm not mistaken, it is the second most read article that's ever been published in the journal. Who's going to read the commentary where we say, hey, here's a million problems with the article, like maybe let's hold our horses? No one's going to read it. Like it's just not going to get out to anybody. So anyway, I'm going to have another article about why, frankly, it's a beautiful story that we can lean on science, the industry, to carefully curate and thoughtfully peer review and do this filtration process that makes sure that what we read in articles can be taken as, you know, very straightforward. I don't want to say matter of fact, but robust enough that there's a broad scientific consensus that this represents high quality, worthwhile evidence. That's a beautiful story, but the good news for us, Helms, and the bad news for humanity is that's not the case. So there needs to be idiots like us that do a podcast every Monday night saying, hey, you know, this new study that everybody's talking about, don't pay attention to it. Or, you know, read the conclusions, then run the other way, you know. And mass research review, I mean, I guess it's good for job security that these things keep getting through peer review. But nonetheless, yeah, it's where are you going? You running out of here?
No, I'm just encouraging people to.
Oh, you're having the T-shirt, more product promotion.
That's right. I mean, this is the issue with publishing, and that it's become far too commercialized. So please buy our shit, because we're going to solve this issue of commercialization by commercializing the decommercialization of commercialization.
But honestly, Helms, I mean, like, I wasn't around when mass was created. I was alive, barely. But I would imagine the best case scenario for the Mass Research Review is that good science is published, and we take that good science and talk about why it's good, and then more importantly, talk about how to apply it. Like that is the concept of why mass is valuable. And unfortunately, I think some of the most valuable articles you get in mass is us just kind of pulling our own hair out and saying, do not trust like this massive percentage of science that's getting published in our field. Massive, of course, is subjective, but a number greater than
An
1% to
annoying
me
amount.
is not
Yeah.
great. So anyway, it's again, it's I guess nice for mass that there's the value of having to do this peer review after papers are published. But again, that's not what we wanted. I don't
No.
think that certainly wasn't the
I've been
goal.
saying since 2012 that my goal as a science communicator is not to be the evidence-based mythbuster constantly playing whack-a-mole and telling you all the things you should not do, but actually telling you what you should do. But it is unfortunate that there's so much misinformation, disinformation, and just fraudulent information in some cases that I have to wade through, and I have to correct the miseducation of people before I can actually be an educator. And that is a frustrating thing. And, but it is something that must be done.
Yeah. But I am a very happy person. I am not my angst on this particular topic stays in this silo and does not permeate through the rest of my life. So that's a good thing. If anyone was concerned about me. But like just Helms, just to give you some context, I could look up the dates and I don't want to spread misinformation while I'm railing on misinformation or dubious information. I believe this paper, I believe it got accepted for publication in September. It
Okay.
might have been early to mid-October. And again, the letter got published 6th of February. The time between acceptance and publication, which is literally posting a blog article, is the technical element that goes into that. So when I say I had to like beg them to publish it, it was like waiting for months and then spending weeks doing emails saying, you literally accepted the paper and you have simply chosen not to publish it. Like, you have to help me understand what's happening here.
So I guess we got to pre-print our letters to the editor from now on.
Yes, if you want to get them up within like 4 months of getting them accepted, that is correct. Now,
Okay.
I don't want to be too complainy. That ship might have sailed already, but
It
all-
we're deep into the Pacific Ocean, my friend.
Yes.
You're nearly. I can almost see you off the shore of
Yeah.
Auckland, my friend.
But all of this is to say, folks, you got to be careful out there reading research. Research is the best tool we have for understanding the world around us, but it is so far from infallible. So you have to read research with an open mind, but your mind should not be so open that it might fall out. And as it pertains to this paper, I want to be very clear. Okay, this original paper about apple cider vinegar. I do not know why the distributions appear to be so wonky. That's why we asked. Okay? I do not know how they managed to do a study like this and have zero dropout. That's why we asked. I do not know if diet intake didn't change and physical activity didn't change. I don't know how this weight loss occurred, which is why we asked. I want to be very clear. I have not made a single accusation. I am a person who asks questions, and if all they did was publish the data like they said they did in the paper. Remember, in the paper they said all the data are publicly available. All we really wanted from the letter to the editor was, you said that, make it so. Just put your data out and we'll shut up, because then we can figure out like what is happening here. And I, as an optimist, remain open to the belief that I would open up that data set and say, oh, okay, I see what happened here. But until we get that, it's like, I don't understand why. I don't have a good reason why you would say, hey, it looks like these distributions must be weird. Can you comment? And the answer is, I will not share my data, and I will not even post figures of what those distributions look like, which would take 2 seconds. And even the corrected version of the paper, as I told the editor of the journal, still has the phrase in there the last time I checked, all the data have been uploaded as a supplementary file. That was like the main reason that we wrote the letter, was like, there's a blatantly false statement in this article. There is no data uploaded. And in the process of correcting it, they just left it. So all of that is to say, I'm just asking questions, and I would sure love some actual answers to it. And unfortunately, the response to our letter provided absolutely no information. And
Well, it's someone not as an author on the correction, who is also not making any accusations, but is very comfortable just speaking what he thinks. If I had to guess, and it would be a guess rather than an accusation or a claim, I don't think this study ever existed or happened or occurred, or if it did, it was replaced with an Excel spreadsheet.
That's because you're a conspiracy theorist, and that's a trait that you carry throughout your life in all walks of life.
That's what I'm known for.
But Helms, you want to know another thing that really got under my skin? And this is the last thing I'll complain about. Then we'll answer questions from the good
There's
people.
There's room underneath your skin for something else?
Yes.
There's a lot under there.
So,
okay, go ahead.
Helms, you're going to know this better than anybody because you've been peer reviewing my mass articles for years. They dared, in their response to me, Helms, to cite the Lakens paper, Daniel Lakens, Calculating and Reporting Effect Sizes to Facilitate Cumulative Science, a primer on t-tests and ANOVAs. I've cited that paper 700 times, and they had the gall to tell me a thing that's in it that isn't actually in it, Helms. And you know how I feel about that paper. It's probably the single paper I've cited more than any in all of my writing in my life. And to have that misquoted at me, oh man.
It probably. I mean, that's the funny thing is that wasn't even the main point of the paper. I mean, I think you basically said you probably should have done an Ancover or a linear model.
Yeah.
But by the way, you managed to recruit people only at the minimum maximum age with no one in the center of the bell curve. Is that accurate? I'm going to ignore that and say, nah. We could have done a t-test. It's fine. I've heard t-tests are fine.
Again, it's the stat thing kills me. As I was writing it, I was like, as we were putting the letter together, I was like, does it even make sense to quibble over the stats when like the effect sizes
the other issues?
You know, like it doesn't matter how you really analyze this, but at the end of the day, it was like, well, if we're going to bother to write the letter, we might as well mention, hey, you know, instead of running 4 t-tests, like how about an ANOVA? We weren't asking for linear mixed models. Just give me an ANOVA, right? It's the least you could do.
I dig it.
All right, Helms, this is officially now just a conversation for you and me, whining about the intricacies of research. So I think at this point, for the good of the people, we owe it to them to not get to the live chat, but let's talk Super Bowl. Everyone chimes in. You know, everyone joins us on Monday nights to hear about football. I'm kidding. I didn't even watch the Super Bowl.
Neither did I.
Completely disinterested. Wow, the questions have absolutely rolled in here. Do you have anything good in the Iron Culture chat that you want to address, or should I grab something out of the...
I've got a bunch.
All right, yeah, let's hear it.
I've got a bunch. Yeah. So first, Joby asks, hello, I love watching your live streaming. Is a high-protein diet still relevant in weight loss? Is it better than an adequate protein diet for weight loss? Joby,
oh boy,
don't you lie to us. Don't you lie to us and say that you're a fan of our live streaming when just last week we live streamed an entire episode about a paper we just published on following a high-protein diet while dieting during weight loss. You're either trolling us, or maybe you've watched every single episode and you just happened to miss last week's. Well, my friend, catch up on last week's because we literally had an entire episode on it, based upon an open access paper, and we had the lead author, our good friend, Dr. Martin Ruffalo, on, because he was the lead author on it, to talk about it.
And Helms, correct me if I'm wrong, but your takeaway from that project was however much protein you're eating now, you should be eating more? Is that correct?
That is definitely the meme position of how people want it to be. Yes, I would agree with that.
For context, go back and listen to that episode, but that paper we published generated a lot of waves. A lot of people put a lot of words in Helms's mouth. I still keep a low enough profile on the internet that no one bothered to attribute them to me, which is great. We'll keep it that way. But yeah, that was a really great episode. I really appreciate Martin for coming on because he crushed it.
He did.
All right, I got
That
one
was
here.
one
I
of
got
the
a quick one
low-hanging
here.
fruit if you got one.
Yeah,
Yeah,
I
go
got a
for it.
quick one here, and you can look for another good one. So the question was, I typically get mild headaches if I consume a largish dose of creatine monohydrate in the 5 to 10 gram range. Is this a known side effect of creatine, and is this something to be concerned about? So this is a really weird one. I wrote a big old article about creatine many years ago, and my master's research was actually on creatine in addition to caffeine. So this is a topic I've dipped my toes in more than once. And when I wrote the original article, I had a section on side effects. And the main side effects you see with creatine are going to be my kidney kind of clinical numbers are a little out of whack, specifically creatinine, which is a completely harmless side effect of creatine ingestion. Now, you could be a person with a kidney problem who takes creatine, so you shouldn't totally ignore it. But high creatinine levels per se, if you're on creatine, are not an issue. As long as your kidneys actually functioning properly. But the other things that come up with creatine are usually just gastrointestinal discomfort, and there's a few ways you can get around that. You can do all the normal stuff. Try to dissolve it better by using a hot beverage. Maybe try to space it out away from caffeine intake. That's a little bit speculative. Divide it into smaller doses. Maybe try it with a meal instead of on an empty stomach. Just the basic standard stuff. But when I wrote that article, there were two side effects that people threw at me that are really not represented in the literature, but at least a couple people threw them at me. One of them was people saying that creatine disrupts their sleep. And the only thing you find about that in the literature is a few little papers that maybe creatine can attenuate some of the negative effects of slightly insufficient sleep or possibly decrease sleep need on a nightly basis by a very small amount. Nothing that I felt compelled to really talk up and write about a lot. But there is at least some little dustings in the literature of some relationship between creatine and sleep. Not a negative relationship, just, it seems like people on creatine can get away with a little bit less sleep, not a lot. And I consider it very speculative. But the other thing that a few people threw into my inbox was this, that when they take creatine, they get headaches. I've not seen that actually reported in the literature to the best of my knowledge. I can't say for sure that in the couple thousand creatine papers, no one said, by the way, 2 people in the creatine group had a headache. But you see that in placebo groups all the time, right? Mm-hmm. A lot of people, they had a headache while they were in a clinical trial and said, by the way, headaches over here. But this is not something that I've seen in the literature. However, the whole point of evidence-based practice, something that, Helms, we've talked about many times, is we use the literature to guide our practice in addition to our own experiences and our own kind of contextualized decisions. So if you've done a little bit of A/B testing, you go on creatine, you get a bunch of headaches, you go off creatine, they stop. You go on creatine, you get a bunch of headaches, you go off creatine, they stop. If you feel like you've observed enough of a track record that for whatever reason you are getting headaches when you're on creatine, I would say I just wouldn't take creatine. Helms, I know that that's sacrilegious in the evidence-based lifting focused world, but at the end of the day, you look at the actual quantified effect sizes of creatine, and if you told me what is the benefit of being on creatine versus what is the benefit of not having headaches regularly, give me the no headaches 10 times out of 10. Okay, so I don't feel like comfortable saying, yes, that is a totally common side effect and creatine is causing your headaches. But if you feel that you've developed a consistent enough track record of observations that you've decided, like, yeah, this just isn't for me, you're not going to miss it. You can't walk through Helms. When you go and win worlds next year or the year after, you're not going to be able this year. You're not going to be able to walk through the lineup and point out the people who are on creatine and the people who aren't. Correct?
Well, I will know that the people who are not on creatine generally are not locked in and not taking it serious enough. So it'll be the
Correct.
other things that they haven't done. So it's more of a correlation than a causation, but your point is well taken.
Well, but the people on creatine, they'll be in the untested category, correct?
Yes,
Yeah.
exactly.
But no, so it's not a huge deal. But you might consider, if you're like, I really want to keep this in there, realistically, if you're talking about 5 or 10 gram doses, you can get a solid benefit from creatine on 3 grams a day. And maybe you take 3 grams in the morning, 3 grams at night, and it circumvents this issue. And now you're taking 6 grams a day, which is plenty, basically regardless of body size. So you could try doing smaller total doses or splitting the dose into smaller chunks twice a day or 3 times a day, or you could just go without. You'll be fine either way. All right, Helms, what do you got over
great
in
advice.
iron culture world?
Okay, we got a couple from Killer Katibi 9 that I can rapid fire a few of these. Are machines better? I'll just summarize this one. Are machines better for joint strain or tendonitis, e.g., a more fixed bar path being better than something that has more movement? And I think for one, you don't want to look at things in this kind of black and white manner of machine versus free weight being better for joint stress, because it just doesn't generalize that way. And then from a pure anecdotal perspective, there are times when it is actually quite the opposite. So we're not built to be perfectly symmetrical. We do have variation left to right. And it is actually a really common thing that some lifters say that, hey, one of my shoulders gets a little niggly when I do a lot of Smith machine pressing, because I have to be in the same position left and right because it's a fixed bar. I can't internally or externally rotate one arm more than the other like I might with a dumbbell, which is free weights. And also, if you look at the bar path, say on a Smith machine, I can predict where it's going to go in the track, hint, hint. But if you look at bar paths on bench press, that actually varies substantially based upon limb length, grip, and style of benching. With sometimes you hear about the quote-unquote J curve and stuff like that. So generally, I would just say the answer is no, and that applies even more broadly that we probably don't want to try to associate specific exercise classes as inherently more or less straining on your joints.
Yeah,
so that's
I
the
just
quick,
want to say
quick one if you want to add anything.
Totally agree. There's some machines that, for the exact reason you said, I don't go near them because I need my asymmetry and I need my weird, wonky bar path to not have pain.
Yep. There's a lot of machines that if you're 5'2" or you're 6'2" are just not going to fit you well, or if you have long relative limbs to or short relative limbs to your torso or height are not going to be great. So honestly, it really does come down to not having kind of a broad view on this topic and approaching it case by case, person by person. Another question, if squats don't train hamstrings because of the simultaneous hip and knee extension, why doesn't the exact same logic apply to deadlifts? So, big picture concept here. What is a heuristic? A heuristic is understanding something in simple terms so that you don't need to go through the cognitive challenge of understanding exactly why and all the specific reasons that something might be the way it is. So when we talk about how biarticular muscles are not effectively trained in compound movements and only by isolation movements, that is a heuristic. And the heuristic is in place because there are certain things that need to occur for a muscle to be active during a movement. First, if you can't actually complete the task or the movement, that is a multi-joint movement, without actual movement at that joint, then it's going to be involved no matter what. So in movements that can be completed with different motor strategies, it's going to depend upon what is the dominant motor strategy, right? So if you were to actually think about being in the bottom of a squat, right, and you never extend your knee, there's no way to get that stick figure to stand back up and be standing up straight without dumping the bar somewhere or dying, right? However, if you were to think about being in an extremely high stance leg press, you could see how you could complete a lot of that movement and then just maybe minimally extend your knee at the end. And in fact, when you look at, say, most notably powerlifters who pull sumo, you will sometimes see them extend simultaneously their knees and hips, lock their knees out, and then complete the last third of the movement with hip extension and back extension. So this changes at different phases. What I'm essentially saying is that different movements are going to be more efficiently completed with using different contributing muscles to greater extents or less based upon whether they are most efficiently used there. So some of the most modern motor theories we have would postulate that we essentially follow the path of least resistance. And if you look at how much of a knee extension torque is required to complete the task of a deadlift in most people with most limb lengths, it is much less than that of the hips and the hamstrings. So while there may be a point where they're not both simultaneously contracting to the same degree to where they would create kind of this canceling out of movement, they are going to be active at different times to different degrees. And for a deadlift, hip extension is going to be the dominant thing you need to do, which is why you do see hamstring activation in studies on RDLs as well as studies on actual deadlifts. And you do probably get more hypertrophy from deadlifts in the hamstrings and glutes and very little in the quads. Interesting fact though, we don't actually have any longitudinal hypertrophy studies, to my knowledge, on deadlifts from the floor that have actually done a really good job comparing that to other forms to really confidently state, yeah, the deadlifts, are great for the hamstrings. There's a little bit out there, but not much.
All right. Good stuff, man. I got a couple over here that I can touch on if you want to
Knock it out,
continue
man.
mining the iron culture chat. So, folks, we have a divide and conquer strategy, Helms and I. I'm monitoring the chat over on the Mass Research Review YouTube page, and Helms is monitoring the Iron Culture Podcast YouTube page because we are literally in two places at once. And as we always say, if you really want to support the show at the top tier as a gold tier supporter, what you would do is actually stream both channels on multiple devices at the same time, just to make sure that we get all of our views accounted for. I do want to acknowledge all the folks mentioning where they're watching from. We got a few folks in California, all the way on the other side of the country. So thank you all. Let's see, it's 4. This started at 4 p.m. I think you folks should still be at work. I think some people are. What's the opposite of wage theft? We've got some people basically committing crimes against their employers, which is very, very bad. All right. We had a question here about a little follow-up on creatine and caffeine. That was the topic of my master's thesis. I could do the whole 90-page spiel, but I'll just give the quick answer. There have been concerns, credible concerns in the literature that for whatever reason, daily high-dose caffeine intake seems to blunt the ergogenic effects of specifically creatine loading. So really high-dose caffeine every day during creatine loading, for whatever reason, makes it such that creatine loading doesn't seem to work the way it normally would. And so people have wondered, do I need to restrict caffeine entirely? Why is this happening? All sorts of questions emerging from there. There's been a handful of studies on the topic. I think definitive answers still elude us, in my opinion. But what I usually tell people is, if you're kind of concerned about it, then what you can do is just take your creatine and caffeine at different times, because it seems like the simplest, most parsimonious justification for why this might occur is simply upsetting your stomach before training. So high-dose creatine and caffeine at the same time might give you a tummy ache. So do your caffeine in the morning, which you should be doing anyway, to avoid sleep disruption. Do your creatine at night, because it doesn't really matter when you take it, and you should be in good shape there. You could also consider caffeine in the morning, half your creatine in the afternoon, half your creatine at night, if taking a whole dose of creatine at once gives you stomach issues on its own. If you're super worried about it, then you can pick and choose. Do I want my caffeine or my creatine? If you're specifically focused on your lifting gains, then I would say you're better off with the creatine than the caffeine. I think the effect sizes in the literature would back me up on that. However, if you're interested in being a happy person, then you might go with the caffeine over the creatine. But really, I don't believe that you have to choose based on the literature that I've seen and the research that I've published on the matter. And I had another question about caffeine and coffee. And the question
I got another one. I'll just throw it in there with you since you have this question. All right, we got Another one, does decaf coffee have the same health benefits as regular without sleep disruptions from caffeine? Is decaf healthier than coffee? Are there unique benefits to caffeinated coffee?
Yeah, so that's the exact question I was going to address. So I think they posted it in both chats, which is technically
Oh,
illegal, but that's okay. We
double
won't
counting.
yeah, we won't report you. But yeah, so here's the thing about coffee. Coffee is not caffeine water. Coffee is water, caffeine, and like last I checked, at least 300 other bioactive compounds or compounds that are believed to be bioactive. So there's a lot going on in the old cup of Joe. And a lot of those phytochemicals, those bioactive plant derived compounds, seem to have, many of them seem to have positive health effects. So I think at this point, there was some early literature saying that coffee is bad for you. And basically what they found out was once you control for the fact that heavy coffee drinkers also tend to be smokers, once you account for that, you actually tend to find that coffee has a net positive impact on health across many different domains. Then the question is that all from caffeine? Is it some from caffeine, or is it none from caffeine? I am of the belief, based on the last time I looked into this, that you can look at decaffeinated coffee or caffeinated coffee and say that both of them seem to be to have a net positive impact on health. Not a life-changing effect on health, but a small positive effect. Is there any additive benefit of the caffeine itself? It's really hard to say. I think that if there is, it's probably more related to some of the cognitive outcomes that we associate with regular coffee drinking, more so than anything that we would talk in the cardiovascular realm or any other number of benefits you might derive from the other compounds in coffee. So I'm not convinced that there's going to be a massive discrepancy in the health benefits from one to the other. The only way I think you can really mess this up is if you have a ton of caffeinated coffee all throughout the day or particularly late at night and you mess up your sleep, because we absolutely know that certain sleep patterns are negatively, they negatively correlate with a variety of health outcomes. So we want to make sure that whatever your strategy is with coffee consumption, the only way to really screw it up is to have a bunch of caffeine at night and to make your sleep pattern all messed up. Okay, so it's kind of a non-answer, but if caffeine has any additional benefit, like I said, it's probably very modest, and I would expect really restricted to those cognitive related outcomes.
Well said. I got nothing to add there.
All right. What do you got over
I
there?
got we've talked about this before, but I think it's worth revisiting because I do think a lot of people struggle with finding an appropriate volume for them. So there is a couple of questions which I'll tackle by Killer Katibi. Is under 10 fractional sets per week optimal for some? How would you determine if lower volume versus higher volume is better for you given studies show dose response? And then a follow-up from that, any tips? Sorry. Does this mean lower volume is best for me? As I've tried to do higher volumes, essentially, I'm kind of essentially just paraphrasing here. I do increasing style volume, moving from 4 to 8 fractional sets per week, 3 to 0 RIR. But anytime I try to do 10 plus, I seem to not be able to recover on most muscles, and I train at home with a rack, Smith, and dual cable machine. So I think the first thing to understand is, what does the research tell us? And it tells us about a general principle and a relationship between two variables. And it is also in the context of short-term studies and averages. And I would say that the best way to interpret, and this is straight out of the lead author's mouths, this data, is that there is a general trend that the more volume you do, the more benefit you get in terms of hypertrophy. However, there are intense diminishing returns. The earlier sets are going to do much more. Individuals are absolutely potentially left or right shifted. And even if they weren't, I would say that long term, some people are going to be able to handle lower practical amounts than they might theoretically benefit from. So if you had a really terrible recovery environment in terms of your nutrition, your sleep, your preponderance of getting joint stress, maybe you just find yourself get emotionally burned out, you just don't like it, you only have access to primary compound movements or what have you, you may find that after 2 to 3 months of doing high volume, you just can't sustain it. So even if you could theoretically benefit from it, if we could remove your bicep from your body, not have it be connected to your brain or connective tissue, and not have it need to be given a appropriate environment of sleep and recovery as part of your holistic, body mind, we might be able to stimulate it with the equivalent amount of tension in a petri dish, and it would grow better from doing 20 sets. But your bicep is still attached to you. So there are definitely people that we see in coaching, and I've seen over 21 years of lifting and 15 years of coaching who seem to do better with lower volumes. And if you repeatedly see that you do better with lower volumes, my advice is that you should probably do lower volumes. And that might be controversial. That if you repeatedly see a phenomenon, it might be true, or at the very least, even if it's not true, it functionally acts as true for you. So stick with it. Yeah. And Trex, you mentioned this before. Sometimes people jump into high volumes all at once with inadvisable exercises or jump ship a little too early before they adapt to it. They don't understand that it might take more than, 1 week at this higher volume to do it. But, we're talking about a guy who goes from 4 to 8 sets and has tried 10 plus. Now, 10 plus is a broad category. Maybe by 10 plus, he means I did 20 and I did it after a week of doing 4 to 8. That would be inadvised. But I think, if this is something that you see repeatedly observed and you're doing all the other right things in your training, then yeah, you might be a low volume guy. They exist.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, Helms, we have another training-related question that we've got a couple people that asked this and another person who said, yes, please answer that. We've answered this before, but
shocking.
I believe that someone must be making content about this because it seems to come up quite a few times. So the question is, it's all about changing grip and biceps hypertrophy or elbow flexor hypertrophy. And the question is, if I'm just doing hammer curls, can I get all my gains? Is pretty much the root of the question. And last we talked about this, I kind of mentioned that I do like to mix up and have a few different types of bicep exercises in my arsenal. Just kind of following on that principle of getting, that nice, complete, the granularity of development that only a bodybuilder would really care about, right?
Sure.
Of hitting things at different angles, different positions, etc. But you, last we discussed, were pretty much of the opinion like, hey, we're flexing the elbow, right? And so if you're doing a bunch of hammer curls and it's sufficiently challenging and you're doing enough volume, you're probably not going to look back and say, if only I had done different grips, I would actually have some arms to speak of. So is that pretty much where you're at on this still?
I would say yeah. And there was actually a recently published study by Cassiano. So we actually have 3 studies now, which is kind of cool, which compare preacher curls to incline curls now. And they're by 3 different groups. We have Cassiano, we have Zabaleta-Corta, and then we also have Mao's group led by Kobayashi. 2 of those are fully published. 1 is a conference abstract. So there is data not... I'm convinced by the data not on grip position, but actually on shoulder position and based upon regional hypertrophy in the elbow flexors, which has been uncovered depending upon whether they're using MRI muscle volume, which is what Kobayashi did, or looking at ultrasound, which is kind of neat. So I could go off on that, but I would say ultimately if we think about just limiting it to grip, some of this is related to the pronation action of the biceps or the pronation or supination action of the brachioradialis, because it kind of brings you back to neutral from wherever it is, and speculations about that. Ultimately, if you're doing a full range of motion through the elbow, I really don't think it makes much of a difference. And it's probably a good thing to avoid anything that gives you tendonitis and allows you to keep training sufficiently and hard. Is it worth me going through the incline curl versus preacher curl stuff and talking about that?
I think we hammered it pun intended.
Ooh.
Yeah, we hammered it the last time we kind of talked about this. I think we're probably both of the opinion that you can get very far if you were just doing hammer curls, or get very far if you were just doing preacher curls, or get very far if you were just doing regular standard dumbbell curls. The thing that I believe we're aligned on, but not sure, is if you wanted absolute peak, if you were interested in those marginal extra 1% gains to give you like just the most full biceps look that would pop on stage, I'm still kind of the belief that you'd probably want to mix and match some exercises in there the same way that you would, you know, like the classic exercise variety study for quad hypertrophy, right? You know, you could get your quads pretty big if you just squat, but if you want, you know, full, you know, symmetrical development across all heads, you probably want to, you know, do several different quad focused exercises. I think the biceps have a lot less going on than the quads, you know, in terms of needing a lot of different angles and variety. But I'm still of the opinion that you probably will feel better as a high level bodybuilder who wants to even turn over the tiny pebbles in addition to the big rocks, saying I'm going to do some stuff with a supinated grip, some stuff with a neutral grip, and maybe even some stuff with a more pronated grip. Are we on the same page there?
Yeah, the pronated grip, most of the time the rationale for that is to train the forearms, and I think a much better way to do that is just to actually do wrist curls
Yeah.
and reverse wrist curls, and I transpose those in the order
to
with
be
my
fair,
visual.
I never actually do pronated curls anymore. But
Yeah.
I threw it in there in the interest of being, I didn't want to leave them out. If we're going to talk about
Yeah.
supination, it feels wrong to not talk about
It's
pronation.
100%.
But yeah,
So yeah,
most
the only thing
curls
I
are
would
gonna
add
be,
there,
yeah, neutral or supinated.
yeah, I think honestly, whether you do neutral or supinated grip should be entirely dependent on discomfort, pain, tendonitis, and need.
Yeah.
I think that's where the most utility is there. And then if we're talking about a bodybuilder who wants to absolutely ensure that they maximize all pathways to hypertrophy and the entire elbow flexor complex, this is where I think shoulder position and resistance profile should be your attention rather than grip position.
Yeah.
So we've got like 3 studies now that have basically all found the same thing to the limit of what they can find. That preacher curls seem to do a really damn good job of hypertrophying your distal biceps. Hint, hint, it's probably your brachialis. That's what Kobayashi found when they looked at it with MRI, and they could distinguish between the brachialis, which is deep to the bicep flexor, the elbow flexor, the biceps. And that's just because when your arm's out in front of you, there's more tension at a longer muscle length, and the brachialis is monoarticular, so it doesn't care, quote unquote, about shoulder position. And then if you want to get a little bit of the benefit of training at a longer muscle length, because the biceps are biarticular and cross the shoulder joint, being in a position of shoulder extension might help. And it's challenging with most traditional gym equipment to accomplish those two things simultaneously, while also feeling like you have a stable shoulder and you're not doing scapular tipping, getting your elbow behind you and stuff like that on like a cable. So, easy way to do it is just do some preachers and do some incline curls.
Man, I love a good single arm dumbbell preacher curl.
Yes, 100%.
That is my favorite bicep exercise of them all. No question.
It's a good one. Very good one.
All right, Helms, I tell you what, man, we've pretty much exhausted a lot of the novel questions in the mass channel. The one thing I do want to address, this is one we've talked about, but I love talking about it, so I'm going to hit it again.
Let's do it.
The question is, are there any upsides or downsides to consuming a high amount of fiber daily? And in this case, we're talking greater than 60 grams. Here's the thing with fiber. It's fantastic. It is, if you look at any of the literature related to gastric health outcomes, being on a low fiber diet, unless you have a good medically indicated reason to do so, is a bad plan. Fiber is fantastic, and what do you know? It happens to be in all the foods that always correlate with positive outcomes with health, right? It's in fibrous vegetables, fibrous fruits, legumes, you name it, right? Whole grain products. So fiber is fantastic. It helps a lot with fullness and satiety. It helps with the production of short chain fatty acids that honestly are slept on in the fitness industry. People don't talk about those enough in the kind of like mainstream evidence-based fitness industry. people do talk a lot about it more in the more biohacker-y type
The
places.
gut microbiome.
Yeah, but like short chain fatty acids are
No, they're legit.
they are very cool physiologically, and they are fully legit. It's the one area where I do have to tip my cap to the more biohacker type crowd, and like, yeah, you guys are talking about that, and we probably ought to talk about it more. But yeah, so high fiber diets are going to, lead to greater production of some of those short chain fatty acids that have a lot of cool functions in the body. So high fiber diet, moderate to high fiber diet's fantastic, but there is a tipping point where you reach too much fiber, and everyone's going to know when they reach it. It's going to differ a little bit from person to person. I've talked to people who do just fine on 70, sometimes 80 grams of fiber a day. I've talked to other people who, when they hit 50.1 grams of fiber, they feel like a big bloated balloon. They're gassy. They have a lot of GI symptoms related to just a whole bunch of fiber in their diet. So everybody's a little bit different. And usually, what I tell people, this isn't exactly pleasant or glamorous, but you should absolutely be getting at least the recommended daily intake of fiber. Usually, a lot of times it's reported as grams of fiber per 1,000 calories as like 14 or 15, but that doesn't really work for weirdos like us who do really high calorie diets and really low calorie diets. So usually you're talking about minimum being in the 25 to 30 gram a day range. I think the bifurcated recommendations for males and females, I think females is like 25 and males is in like the mid 30s, if that sounds right to you, Helms. But either way, we're talking, 30, 35 grams of fiber a day. Going above that can confer a lot of benefits in terms of, all the stuff I talked about previously. But what I usually tell people is get at least the minimum. Eat enough fiber that you're not gassy. You have a stool frequency and a stool consistency that you feel good about. And you'll figure it out. I don't need to get into the nitty gritty details, but basically what I tell people is, if your stool consistency is poor, you might want to go higher with the fiber, assuming that there's no other obvious cause for that. If you're starting to feel really gassy and bloated, you might have gone too high. And so we kind of use those to kind of navigate toward a comfortable level. Helms, do you give any other like practical tips for helping people sort out their fiber intake?
Like basically 10 grams per 1,000 calories in your diet with a minimum of, I think, whatever the minimum is that's recommended. I want to say it's those values you gave.
Yeah.
I find that's pretty easy.
Yeah.
And another one is one serving of fruit and vegetables per every 1,000 calories in your diet. That's another one that'll indirectly get you there, but also get you those wonderful phytonutrients.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
All right, good stuff. So what do we got over in I think we're heading
Honestly,
over to your end of the woods here.
Yeah, we got some quick fire training ones actually, which complements that quite nicely, and then I think we can wrap it up.
Yeah.
So
sounds good.
All right. I'm going to summarize this one from Brown Jenkin. Basically, given the current state of literature on lengthened partials and the lengthened position, do you think there's any utility of the contraction? And by that, I think they mean like the peak contraction or the shortened position. We don't have enough. Well, let's put it this way. There is no data that has ever found shortened training to outperform lengthened training. Plenty of data that finds no significant difference between the two, and that's likely because there's just a small overall effect here. So I have no reason to believe that there's something special or unique as it relates to regional hypertrophy in the shortened position, but I also don't want to confuse evidence of absence for absence of evidence. The one thing I will say, though, is that there is, I can't remember if it's pre-printed or fully published, but there's a meta-analysis that indicates that there is not really much regional hypertrophy to speak of in response to lengthened partials or just training at longer muscle lengths, even though it has been reported in some studies. And this is actually a really interesting methodological artifact when you think about how this is done. So if you use ultrasound, what you do is you take a point along the limb itself using bony landmarks, so the humerus or the femur, and then you say, oh, we're going to measure this at 40%, 70%, 60%, 80%, whatever of that point. And depending upon the actual attachment sites of that individual, that might not be very proximal or distal. It might be a little more mid-belly. And if you have a small sample size study, that can get some variability in there. Another thing to consider, and that's with thickness. With cross-sectional area, sometimes you will be able to use the muscle itself and decide, okay, we used the largest point of the muscle, and that was the mid-belly cross-sectional area slice we're going to look at. And then we used a distance from that. The best tool, though, however, is MRI, which can actually tell you muscle volume. And then you can just start at the point where you operationally define as the finishing point of the tendon and the beginning of the actual muscle itself. And you can give measurements along the whole thing. And remember that if you're looking at proximal or distal growth, the muscle is tapering into the tendon. So you're looking at small changes and a small absolute mass, which inflates the error. And if you look at some of the studies that have found the significant differences at proximal or distal sites, you'll notice that they have really high standard deviations, despite still being significant. And when meta-analyzed, some of this effect starts to go away. So I actually think there is some regional hypertrophy that occurs. We do get inhomogeneous hypertrophy across muscles, and it is based upon where's the tension applied. I'm not disputing that. But I think when it really comes down to it, in the case of long-term training with multiple exercises, it's not going to be a really huge thing. And we should probably focus more on what I would describe as muscle compartment specific hypertrophy, like looking at the rectus femoris versus the vastus lateralis, not quibbling over, well, but did the 80% distal portion of my vastus lateralis grow more than the 20%? Okay. The next one, I know that was supposed to be rapid fire. That felt kind of like a long answer, didn't it? Does heavy lifting promote more muscle growth in the lower body versus moderate weight in the upper body? Do we need to do different rep ranges or loads for these? The answer is, strictly speaking, no. We have pretty substantial meta-analyses on different load training and multiple muscle groups showing that both, if you do a similar volume and a similar proximity to failure, can produce hypertrophy. But practically, it is important to point out that doing high reps on compound exercises that train a whole lot of muscle and produce a whole lot of discomfort and cardiorespiratory fatigue may be harder to gauge the proximity to failure on, or at least feel like you can do that sustainably. If you were to do the same 3x15 at a 0 to 1 RIR on cable rows, bench press, and squats, you would feel like it was much more challenging to do that on squats, and you might actually not be at a 1 RIR. So my general recommendation is to do moderate and moderately low, but still sufficiently high rep to be in the quote-unquote hypertrophy rep range, say 4 or 5 reps or more in the lower body, because it doesn't produce as much discomfort, so you can actually gauge true proximity to failure. And then the very last question, Trex, and then I'm going to let you take us into the sunset, is does your fitness become a factor to pay attention to when using time-saving strategies such as supersets, rest pause, etc.? And I can tell you that yes, it does. It really depends upon kind of the experience level you have. If you're someone who's very, very sedentary, does not have an athletic background, and you only lift weights and you've been doing it for a low volume, and you've been traditionally kind of having very casual rest times, looking at your phone, talking to people, and for
Reading
you
mass,
getting through 10, exactly, like you might
watching
do
Iron
between
Culture.
sets, all these, common activities people do at any time, but especially in the gym, then you might actually be at a baseline level of fitness that is insufficient to start implementing some of these time-saving strategies. In the longitudinal and acute studies we have, there's about 1 point higher on the RPE scale to go through, say, circuit training or superset training of the same protocol, even when you do the same amount of work, if you're following kind of some of the traditional antagonist paired set stuff. So be aware that that can be the limiting factor. There's actually a series of studies by DeSalle where they started at 2 minutes rest between sets, and they went all the way down to 30 seconds, and they were dropping, I think, 15 seconds a week. And they compared that to a group that stayed at 2 minutes, if I recall correctly. Similar hypertrophy between the two. Now, I do think if they carried that study out for another 8 weeks, you'd probably see worse hypertrophy in the group that was at 30 seconds. But when you contrast DeSalle with other studies where they just compare 1 minute to 3 minutes, for example, you typically see better hypertrophy and longer rest intervals. So when you kind of triangulate that data, that tells you that building up to having a higher training density is something that can alleviate some of those downsides to not resting long enough. And when we look at meta-analytic data, you do get a little bit lower volume load and might have to use lower loads resting, say, 90 seconds versus, say, 3 minutes, but not to the point where it actually compromises hypertrophy in these longitudinal studies. And it certainly changes based upon how strong you are, which is a proxy for your experience, probably how good a shape you're in, and probably based upon exercise selection. But one of the simplest things you can do to save time would be to take your traditional 4 minute rests, cut them down to 90 seconds to 2 minutes. You'll cut your time in half, and then your 3 sets are getting done in a minute and a half, like 1.5 sets, and then just do an additional set. And you'll probably actually get better results in shorter time at the cost of it being more taxing from a cardiorespiratory perspective. So I think this is something you might need to build up to, but it really does depend upon the individual.
All right, man. Good stuff. I think that does it for yet another beautiful episode of Iron Culture, episode 314, that we just keep stacking them up. Wonderful episode on top of wonderful episode. Now, what makes the episode special and good, of course, is the contributions from the good listeners at home and in the live chat. So everyone in the live chat, thank you so much for contributing questions. Someone even apologized for repetitive questions. There is never a need to apologize. We may give you a little jab. We may poke you in the ribs, but it's all love here, you know. What, Helms, name a friendship you've had in life that didn't involve a little bit of good-natured ribbing, right? I mean, that's what friendship is, you know. You poke fun at each other, but you support each other, and you still answer the question that's been asked many times, right? So
100% agree.
absolutely no reason to apologize. We are so thankful and so grateful that you join us every Monday night, and we're already looking forward to the next one. So everybody, take care, have a fantastic week, and we will see you in 7 days.